Irvin Studin, Global Brief Magazine. Welcome back after the great quarantine. Let's talk about the consequences of the pandemic. Let's talk about the consequences of the pandemic. I hope everyone is well around the world. Thanks to our readers for your loyalty and for your interest. What a great time to talk about international affairs and the great complexity of the world post-pandemic. For everyone's information, we at Global Brief Magazine and the Institute for 21st Century Questions, based out of Toronto in Canada, will be holding two major virtual conferences this fall. The first one on the future of the world post-pandemic. Watch for our terrific global lineup. We'll have everyone there. And the second major conference on the future of Canada in particular post-pandemic. Also all the major speakers across ideologies, across party lines, across the disciplinary expertises. Watch for that and hope to see you soon. Now, to the pith and substance of the matter. Let me name three great consequences of this pandemic. The first is the most tragic one in my view, the destitching of the global order. All the work that's been done over the last 3/4 of a century since the Second World War to stitch up a peaceful world, not just in economic terms, but certainly in strategic terms, in terms of international understanding, consolidated after the end of the Cold War, again through the economic order, through social and cultural sharing, through travel, through learning, through educational exchanges, through great migration, international migration, and all generally for the peace is being destitched now. Now, there are some elements that might be worthy therein, depending on one's fancy, but by and large, it is a reversal of huge human labor and advancement. So, destitching in economic terms, regulatory around the world, great bottlenecks put between continents and countries in terms of travel, trade, human movement, learning, migration, cooperation. All of these things will accelerate and consolidate in many cases, even accidentally, but for lack of choreography internationally, it will be very, very difficult to reverse in the near term. Another manifestation of that destitching, it takes the form of destabilization of many states, especially weak states around the big states, states around the United States, states around Russia, all the former Soviet states, and certainly around China, as China also begins to either get nervous or try to recover from the great pandemic. So a destitching there. Watch also for possible military destitching. Decreased confidences between societies, between continents, between ideologies, between countries, across borders, even within countries, can accentuate now the possibility of great conflict in our time. Let's not hope for it, but certainly a manifestation of a world that's destitching and that will have to be restitched in ways that are still to be imagined. We'll return to that in the later consequences. Second great consequence. I'm going to try to enunciate five. The second one is the paradoxical start of what I call the Asian century, the real jumping, as it were, of China to the head of the world order. Whatever one makes of that country, for good or ill, China now emerges after this pandemic, even as the paradoxical source of the pandemic, as the major country in the world. Much more important than the United States, more important than Russia. We'll return to those two in a second. But really the one to watch. It will be the strongest economically coming out of the pandemic, the most confident even in terms of its ability to reckon with future such disasters, and the one to which many countries and civilizations will look to for guidance and also economic help and help in terms of restitching a global order. It won't be a global order of the Bretton Woods manifestation or of the post-Cold War manifestation. It will have a different look, and China will be one of the centers, if not the center of it. Again, for better or ill, but that's to be reckoned with. It happens in paradoxical form because China, again, is the source of the pandemic. It emerged reasonably successfully from it. Other societies are still struggling to reckon with it, including in the West, certainly on other continents, and yet China emerges reasonably confident and with some momentum. So that's the second major point. Third major point is that there are three major powers still in the world, three China number 1, I would argue, number 2, just by a whisker, the United States, and trailing quite significantly Russia. But because these 3 powers control so much physical territorial real estate, economic real estate, and strategic geopolitical assets and relationships and infrastructure, they really have a veto power, each of them, on the look and feel of the post-pandemic world order. So that's something to watch for, the relationship between these 3 major powers. Let's hope it will be a friendly one, but right now it's increasingly unfriendly, particularly between China and the United States. You actually have 3 major conflicts in the world that now are tied at the hip and ensconced amongst themselves in Gordian knots that are increasingly difficult to unravel. The first is the crumbling of the Middle East order since 2003. That joined at the hip with the Russia-West conflict after the Syrian intervention in 2015 by Russia and Moscow. So those 2 joined up. And from 2016-2017, the United States-China conflict now joined at the hip with the other 2 conflicts post-pandemic. So those 3 major powers, watch for how they interact. Watch for governance regimes and governance pushes, sanctions, counter-sanctions, and either a destitching of the global order by virtue of deep non-confidence between the 3 of them, or some sort of heroic push, heroic leadership, which is much in need among the 3 or perhaps 2 of them, led by one of them perhaps, to try to restitch the global order. Number 4, global institutions. Not in decay, but increasingly not à la hauteur, as it were, of world circumstance. How do we keep a peaceable world order, at least in a de minimis form, with the post-Cold War or Bretton Woods global institutions? Increasingly not obvious. We're going to have to reinvent major ones, and those 3 major powers of which I spoke will be at the center of the actions. But there'll be other major countries that should play a role. European Union, the major countries there, Canada, India, some of the major Middle East countries, some Brazil perhaps Argentina, Israel, Singapore. Watch for these countries to play major intellectual or convening roles in some of these structures. One that we've commended to the world immediately in the post-pandemic context is the idea of an Arctic League structured around the base of the Arctic Council, but now including China and with a much more de maximis form, imagining intense travel amongst all the Arctic states and near Arctic states, including Asian states, because obviously they bring the relevance to the Arctic now for the first time in modern history. And also that is where all the major powers actually touch each other, for now in peaceable form. It's also the place in which you can have a destitching of the order if you don't have confidence measures. So an Arctic League, in my view, led by Canada, perhaps out of a structure called the White Horse Treaty, based in Canada, could actually stitch these major countries together across this huge Arctic space and create a major touch point of peace where the world is really in need of this. Final consequence, not unrelated to global institutions, is the unraveling of major ideologies. Democracy, withered democracy in the post-pandemic order, not clear. It's going to have to be not just legitimated, but reinvented in a meaningful way in practice for the post-pandemic 21st century. Classical economics, liberal economics, classical liberalism or neoliberalism, supply side economics, small state economics, all of these things look very precarious, even though they're textbook legitimate. They look precarious in practice in a post-pandemic world where the state is very big. You also have an apolitical society, because in some cases you have the assertion of what I call an artificial intelligence totalitarianism, and on the other side, a totalitarianism by stupor, where the population is either too scared or too removed from the center of decision making to be able to mount a reasonable contest for power or reasonable correctives to public policy. So whether political ideology, economic ideology, and indeed ideology of the state and society and their coexistence between across all these major forces. We'll see you soon.